They tell us Paul died a martyr's death. A noble ending for a man who carried the gospel to the ends of the earth. But what they don't tell you is the dark secret behind it. Paul didn't just die. He was executed in cold blood by one of the most monstrous rulers in history, Nero Caesar. And Rome has spent centuries covering up just how twisted, political, and brutal his death really was. Why would the greatest preacher of Christ be struck down by the Emperor of Rome? Why was he not crucified like Peter, but instead beheaded? And why did Nero single him out during one of the bloodiest persecutions in Christian history? The truth is chilling. Nero wasn't just killing Christians, he was using them as scapegoats, human torches, and public sport. And in the middle of this nightmare, Paul became one of his most important targets. The death of Paul wasn't just about silencing one man. It was about silencing the voice of the gospel in the heart of the empire. Stay with me, because in this episode we will walk into the dark streets of Rome, into Nero's palace of madness, and finally into the very dungeon where Paul awaited his execution. And by the end, you'll see why Paul's death wasn't just history, it was prophecy fulfilled. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button, tap like, and comment below Rome's secret so I know you're ready to uncover what they tried to hide. When you picture Paul the Apostle, what comes to mind? Many imagine him standing boldly in the marketplaces, proclaiming Christ. Others see him writing letters, pouring out wisdom to the churches. But by the end of his life, Paul wasn't standing free. He was in chains, in Rome, awaiting a sentence he knew would end in death. This was not his first imprisonment. Earlier, Paul had been under house arrest in Rome, around 60 AD, allowed visitors and even able to preach and teach from his rented house. That imprisonment was almost comfortable compared to what was coming. But when we arrive at the year 64 AD, everything changed. Rome had been set on fire, and the city was engulfed in chaos. The fire consumed districts for nearly a week. Homes, temples, and shops burned to the ground. Tens of thousands were left homeless, and the air was filled with suspicion. And who was accused of starting the fire? Not Nero, though most citizens whispered that he ordered it himself. No, Nero turned the blame on a group already hated and misunderstood, the Christians. Imagine the fear. In Rome's alleys, mobs searched for believers. In Nero's gardens, Christians were dipped in tar, set ablaze, and used as human torches to light his parties. In the arenas, they were fed to wild beasts for entertainment. This was the world Paul lived in when he was arrested a second time. Why Paul? Why now? Because Paul was no ordinary Christian. He was a leader, a voice, a man whose influence reached not only across Israel but across Asia Minor, Greece, and even Rome itself. His letters were being copied, shared, and read aloud. To Rome, Paul was dangerous, not because he wielded a sword, but because he wielded words sharper than any blade. His gospel was spreading faster than Nero's fear. This time, Paul was not placed under house arrest. He was thrown into the Mamertine prison, a dungeon beneath the city, a place where prisoners were often starved or left to rot. Cold, dark, and foul, this was the place where Paul awaited his trial. Some historians describe it as a circular underground chamber with only one hole in the ceiling through which food, or a rope for execution, could be lowered. Think about it. Paul, the man who once stood before governors and kings, now shivering in the darkness, cut off from nearly everyone he loved. His companions had scattered, many too afraid to associate with him in this time of persecution. Only a few remained faithful. Timothy was urged to come quickly. Luke, the physician, stayed near. But most deserted him. And yet, even here, Paul never stopped his mission. From this prison, he wrote what would become his final letter, 2 Timothy. His words are not bitter, not hopeless, but filled with faith. He writes, "I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time for my departure is near. I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith." Imagine that. Sitting in chains, knowing death was near, Paul still spoke of victory. But Nero had other plans. To Nero, Paul was nothing more than another criminal, another scapegoat to feed the rage of the crowds. The trial would be swift. The execution, brutal. Paul's blood would join that of countless others, staining the soil of Rome. Before we move into the heart of the persecution and Nero's madness, pause for a moment and think about this. Paul was not a defeated man in that prison. He was victorious in spirit. While Nero sat on a golden throne, Paul sat on a cold stone floor. But who do you think history remembers as greater? The emperor who killed, or the apostle who lived and died for Christ? If you're following this journey, comment below, "Paul fought the good fight." Let's see how many stand with his legacy. And don't forget to like and share this, because the world needs to hear the truth about what Rome tried to silence. To understand why Paul was executed, you must first understand Nero. He was no ordinary emperor. History remembers him as one of the most cruel, unstable, and self-indulgent rulers Rome ever had. Born into power, he was crowned emperor at just 17 years old. But instead of leading with wisdom, Nero lived for pleasure, vanity, and destruction. The turning point came in July of 64 AD, when Rome was engulfed in flames. The fire raged for 6 days and 7 nights, consuming nearly 2/3 of the city. Ancient sources claim that while the city burned, Nero stood watching from his palace tower, strumming a lyre, and singing about the destruction of Troy. True or not, the rumor spread like wildfire. The people believed their emperor had deliberately set the city ablaze to clear land for his dream project. The Domus Aurea, a golden palace complex unlike anything the world had seen. Nero needed someone to blame, and the Christians were the perfect scapegoat. They were already despised, accused of being atheists for refusing to worship Rome's gods, of practicing cannibalism for their eating the body and blood of Christ, and of plotting rebellion because they followed a king greater than Caesar. To the Roman public, Christians were strange, secretive, and easy to hate. So Nero unleashed a storm of persecution. Christians were arrested in the streets, dragged before courts, and forced to confess under torture. Some were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified, while many were dipped in pitch, impaled on stakes, and set on fire to illuminate Nero's gardens at night. Imagine the horror of Rome's streets echoing with the screams of believers, while citizens gathered to watch as if it were theater. And in the midst of this bloodshed stood Paul. His name was already infamous across the empire. He had debated philosophers in Athens, challenged idol worship in Ephesus, and even appealed to Caesar himself in his earlier trial. To Nero, Paul was not just another Christian. He was a leader, a symbol, and therefore, a threat. Some historians suggest that Paul was rearrested during this very wave of persecution. It's possible that informants betrayed him, or that Rome's officials, already aware of his movements, saw the perfect chance to silence him once and for all. What's chilling is this: Nero may not have cared who Paul really was or what he truly preached. All he saw was an opportunity to sacrifice a leader, to satisfy the crowd's thirst for blood, and to prove that he, not Christ, ruled Rome. This was the context of Paul's final imprisonment. Nero's madness created an environment where Christians were treated as criminals, as outcasts, as scapegoats. And Paul, chained in the Mamertine dungeon, knew exactly what that meant. His trial would not be fair. His verdict would not be just. The decision had already been made: death. But here's the irony. While Nero thought he was silencing Paul, he was only magnifying his voice. Paul's letters, written during these final days, were preserved and copied. His testimony, sealed in blood, spread further than Nero could ever imagine. The emperor's golden palace eventually crumbled into ruins, but Paul's words still live on today. So let me ask you this: who was truly victorious, the emperor draped in gold, or the prisoner draped in chains? Comment below. Paul's voice lives on, if you believe the apostles' message defeated Nero's sword. And don't forget, subscribe so you don't miss the shocking details of how Paul faced his execution in the next part. Picture the scene: a dimly lit Roman courtroom, filled with the tension of life and death. Before Nero's appointed judges stands Paul, no longer the fiery traveler who crossed seas, planted churches, and shook cities with his preaching. Now he is older, weary, scarred by beatings, chained at the wrists, and facing the full weight of the Roman Empire. Paul's crime? Not theft. Not murder. Not rebellion in the military sense. His only offense was proclaiming Christ as Lord, a statement Rome could not tolerate, because for them, Caesar was Lord. Historical records and Paul's own writings suggest that this was not Paul's first trial in Rome. Years earlier, he had appealed directly to Caesar and was acquitted. But this time, the atmosphere was different. Nero was no longer curious, he was hostile. The emperor's fury against Christians was at its peak. And Paul, as their leader, was destined to be made an example. In 2 Timothy, Paul hints at the loneliness of his trial. He writes, "At my first defense, no one came to stand by me, but all deserted me. But the Lord stood by me and gave me strength." Think about that. The great apostle who once gathered thousands, now left abandoned, betrayed, and alone. No friends. No allies. No defense. Imagine him standing there, the chains clinking on the cold stone floor, as Rome's officials read the accusations. A stirring unrest among the people. A refusing to honor the gods of Rome. A spreading a dangerous superstition about a crucified Jew who claimed to be king. In Nero's Rome, this was enough to sign your death sentence. Because Paul was a Roman citizen, he was spared crucifixion, a punishment reserved for slaves and the lowest of criminals. Instead, he was sentenced to death by beheading, considered the merciful execution for citizens. Merciful? Perhaps by Roman standards, but for Paul, it was a final earthly humiliation. But here is where the story turns. While Rome saw this as Paul's defeat, Paul himself saw it as victory. In his last recorded words, he declared, "I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness." Think about the courage that took. The courtroom was filled with hostility, yet Paul looked beyond the sword of Rome to the crown of eternity. He was not terrified of Nero, because he served a higher king. And so, the verdict was sealed: death. Paul was handed back to the guards and returned to his dungeon cell, awaiting the moment when the executioner's blade would fall. But here's the haunting question. Was Nero really the one in control, or was Paul's life, and even his death, still in the hands of God? Comment below. The faith never dies, if you believe Paul's execution was not the end, but the beginning of something greater. And make sure to subscribe, because in the next part we'll step outside the city walls of Rome, to the very place where Paul's blood was spilled, and history was forever changed. It is a bleak Roman morning. The sky is gray, the air heavy, as soldiers march the Apostle Paul through the cobbled streets, out beyond the city gates. The crowd is not large. This is no grand spectacle like the Colosseum Games. No roaring thousands. Just a quiet, almost forgotten death outside the city. Rome had decided Paul was not worthy of glory and death, only silence. They led him to a place known as the Aquae Salviae, the waters of salvation, later called the Three Fountains, just outside the city of Rome. This was where executions by beheading were carried out. Imagine Paul, bound, yet walking with unshaken faith, each step bringing him closer to the sword that would separate his head from his body. Unlike Peter, who was crucified upside down in shame, Paul had the privilege of a quicker death. But for the soldiers and officials, it was routine. For Paul, it was destiny. The guards stood him before the executioner. The crowd waited silently. Perhaps some Christians secretly lingered nearby, unable to stop the inevitable, but desperate to witness their beloved teacher's final moments. Did Paul tremble? Did he hesitate? We cannot know. But what we do know is what he had written shortly before this moment. For me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. To Paul, this was not the end. This was the doorway to glory. And then, it happened. The executioner raised the sword. One swift stroke. Paul's head fell. His body collapsed. The silence of Rome was broken only by the sound of steel and the gasp of those watching. The man who had written more than half the New Testament, the missionary who had crossed empires, the voice who had thundered against paganism and lifted up Christ, was dead. But legend says something strange occurred at that moment. Some early Christian traditions claim that when Paul's head fell, it bounced 3 times, and at each place where it struck the ground, a fountain of water sprang up, hence the name 3 Fountains. Was it symbolic? Was it myth? Or was it heaven's way of saying, Paul's life could be cut short, but his faith would flow forever? And here's what's chilling. While Rome thought it silenced him, Paul's words lived on. His letters would be copied, read, preached, and carried far beyond the empire Nero ruled. Rome killed Paul's body, but Rome could not kill Paul's message. The blood spilled that day became the seed of faith for generations. Pause and reflect on this. One man's execution in a forgotten corner of Rome helped ignite a movement that toppled empires, changed civilizations, and still transforms lives today. That is the true power of God over human history. If you believe that truth cannot be silenced, write in the comments, "The word lives on." And don't forget to subscribe, because in the next part we'll uncover what happened after Paul's death, how Nero's empire spiraled into chaos, and how the martyrdom of Paul shook Rome to its core. Paul was gone. His head severed, his body discarded. To Rome, it was just another execution, another nuisance silenced. But history tells us, the ripple effect of his death was far more dangerous than Nero ever imagined. You see, when Rome kills a criminal, their name is erased, forgotten. But when Rome killed Paul, they gave his message a crown. His followers did not scatter in fear, they grew bolder. His letters, written from prison, from chains, from suffering, now carried a new power. They were no longer the words of a man alive, but the testament of a martyr. And martyrdom, in the ancient world, was more powerful than an army. But Nero didn't stop with Paul. He unleashed one of the most violent waves of Christian persecution in history. He blamed Christians for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, using them as scapegoats for his failures. Men and women were burned alive as torches to light his gardens. Others were fed to lions, crucified, or slaughtered in ways too brutal to imagine. Rome became a stage of blood, and Nero reveled in it. Yet here's the irony: the more Christians he killed, the faster the movement spread. Tertullian, a later Christian writer, would put it perfectly: the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Every execution fueled more conversions. Every death told the world, these people are willing to die for their faith. And nothing terrifies an empire more than a people who do not fear death. But Nero's arrogance caught up with him. History records that within just a few years of killing Paul, Nero's empire collapsed. Betrayed by his own guards, condemned by the Senate, Nero fled Rome. Alone, abandoned, despised, he took his own life in disgrace. The same man who tried to erase Paul's voice was erased from Rome's throne. Now here's where it gets even darker. Some early Christian traditions whispered that Nero's persecution of the church was so violent, so demonic, that they believed he was a kind of Antichrist figure. They feared he would rise again from death, fueled by Satan himself, to continue his war against God's people. That's how terrifying his legacy became. But the truth is this: Nero's fire burned out. Paul's flame burned on. The Roman emperor who wore a crown of gold was forgotten in ashes. The apostle who wore chains of iron is remembered by billions. Tell me, who truly won that day? Rome or the gospel? So as we close this shocking story, take this to heart. The world may silence voices, but it cannot silence truth. Empires crumble, kings die, dictators fall, but the word of God, the message Paul bled for, still lives. If you're watching this right now and you believe truth always outlives lies, type in the comments, "Truth wins." And don't forget to subscribe, because more biblical secrets and hidden histories are coming that you will not want to miss. So what do we learn from this bloody tale of Rome and its emperor? Nero thought his cruelty would destroy Paul's mission. He believed that by cutting off the head of the apostle, the body of the church would wither and die. But history showed us the opposite. Paul's blood became seed. His chains became a testimony. His death became the victory that fueled a movement that outlived Rome itself. Think about it. Rome was once the greatest empire the world had ever seen, ruling with unmatched power. Today, Nero is remembered only for his madness, cruelty, and disgrace. But Paul, the prisoner, the outcast, the executed man, is remembered as a giant of faith, with his letters still read by millions every single day. That's the secret Rome tried to hide. When truth is buried, it doesn't die. It multiplies. When God's servants fall, his word rises. And when the world thinks it has silenced light, the light shines brighter in the darkness. So here's my challenge for you. When you see evil winning, when you see truth attacked, remember Paul. Remember that no empire, no dictator, no tyrant can ever bury God's plan. Truth always wins. If this episode opened your eyes, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone today. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop in the comments, "Truth lives on." Because Paul's voice did not die in Rome, it lives in us.